I need this. Hi everyone, my name is Luke. I am a Flutter developer, and I might have a little bit of a reputation of being one of the most pessimistic Flutter developers in existence. At least I'd like to think I have that reputation. And I saw this video from Theo, and I started watching it, and I figured it would be probably a good idea for me to do a reaction video. And so we're just going to go for it. We are drinking kombucha, and it is late here, and we're going to give this a shot. See how it goes.
So I decided to dedicate a little bit of time at the beginning here to complaining about Flutter because I do not like Flutter.
That's a good thing. Not liking Flutter is a good thing because there's a lot of people who, you know, just love Flutter unconditionally, and Flutter, like any technology, needs detractors. So I'm glad that somebody doesn't like Flutter, because then maybe we can expose some things that Flutter can do better.
Crazy week and a half or however long it's been since YouTube randomly decided that the algorithm likes my videos and started just spinning them everywhere. So yeah, welcome all the new audience that has recently watched my YouTube videos and decided you wanted to be here live. I super appreciate y'all for being here. Very excited for the show today. Idling for a little bit as people are like coming in slowly. Today's show is going to be fun. I am going to dedicate this Web Dev Wednesday to mobile because almost everybody who responded in my polls, especially on YouTube, seemed to really want to see me work with React Native. I did get a few questions about...
React Native is awesome technology. It truly is. There are reasons that I don't use it, but it is fantastic technology.
Flutter, though. So I decided to dedicate a little bit of time at the beginning here to complaining about Flutter because I do not like Flutter. I think there are some questionable design decisions that prevent Flutter from being a thing I can ever recommend in good conscience to anybody. For those that don't know what Flutter is a new mobile development framework and ecosystem created by Google to be a multi-platform alternative to React Native.
Okay, so for people who are kind of new to this, I'm not familiar with the BMW app, although I know that they have done some work with Flutter. We got the MGM app, which was done, oh gosh, I'm not even going to say the name because I'm going to get it wrong. There's a agency, a Flutter agency that built that. And then it looks like we have the Philips Hue app, and those are the only ones. Oh, with Stadia Pro, I haven't actually used that app, so I don't know anything about it. There's actually some other really good ones that aren't listed here. One of those is the Tonal app, which is kind of hard for people to download and use because you need to have purchased a Tonal to be able to use it. But that's a really good app. Little shameless plug there. And what else? The Reflectly app is also pretty good. And there are some others, I'm sure, but those are two that come to mind. Oh yeah, and then of course the Hamilton app. That's been like the example since the beginning of time. That was like the first like big popular Flutter app that went live.
And I want to emphasize that part. It is very much an alternative to React Native in its design intent, in its architecture, in its language choice, and almost everything. It feels like Flutter was consciously designed to be as anti-React Native as possible.
I disagree here. Flutter, quite frankly, I don't think gives a shit about React Native at all. I don't think React Native is really anything that they concern themselves with. They made some decisions that are different than what React Native made. And in some cases, they are opposite decisions. But I don't think anyone who is part of the Flutter team or who contributes to the Flutter source loses any sleep over React Native. I know plenty of people who use both technologies, and they're happy to use both because they both have pros and cons. And I think any competent engineer would be able to choose one or the other without getting clouded by their own personal opinions about these technologies or what they're trying to do. As a general rule, I think it's a good idea to not try to look behind the curtain, because there's so many things that go into these decisions that if you believe someone's doing something in a malicious way, what's more likely is that there's just some very boring reason why they're doing something the way they're doing it.
I understand why people would want that, and I appreciate the pushback on something that came to be and got as popular as React Native did as quickly as it did, but I still am hesitant to recommend Flutter simply because so many of those decisions are almost like comically anti-developer and anti-user.
This should be interesting. There are things about Flutter that I'm not a huge fan of, but I've yet to see anything be truly anti-developer or anti-user. I've seen decisions that may, prioritize one thing over the other, but I haven't seen any indication that anyone's being like actively anti-developer or anti-user.
One great example of this, React Native might be JavaScript that you write to describe the logic, describe like how data is being fetched, what renders where. But under the hood, React Native isn't JavaScript, it's native. That's why it's called React Native. React Native.
So under the hood, under the hood, it's both. So it's orchestrating native views, but to say under the hood it's native is a little bit disingenuous because it's actually both. It's all the logic and all the orchestration is being done in JavaScript, and the actual physical views are native views. And I think you might actually get into the Skia thing a little bit later, but there's a reason why React Native Skia is such an exciting project. We'll get into that as we keep going.
Tells the native platform what to render. So if I write a React Native button component, then on iOS, it's going to render a native iOS button. And on Android, it's going to render a native Android button. And on Xbox, it's going to render a native Universal Windows Project Xbox button.
So this is the whole React Native learn once, write anywhere concept, which is different than Flutter, which is more like write once, run everywhere. And both have pros and cons, like anything engineering, both have pros and cons. But in this case, he's absolutely right. So if you write a button in React Native, on iOS, you're getting a native iOS button. On macOS, you're getting a native macOS button. On Windows, you're getting a native Windows button. On Xbox, I didn't know there's Xbox React Native, but it doesn't surprise me because I think there's a React Native renderer for just about anything you can think of. You would be getting a native Xbox button. And that's all awesome. The problem is when you want to do more code sharing, this approach kind of goes against code sharing because each individual platform may have unique considerations about their buttons and their text fields and all these other things that they use on a day-to-day basis that is you'll have to wrangle each platform individually, whereas in something like Flutter or a good parallel is Unity, if you design a button, it's going to render identically everywhere because it's rendering in like a Skia, on like the Skia layer.
Platform gets its native solution. React Native is just the tool to dictate what native pieces go where, and then that native layer renders the correct thing for itself. Flutter thinks it's better than native. Flutter built its own whole rendering system called Skia, which is...
So this is a little pedantic, but Skia actually existed long before Flutter did. Skia was, a great piece of, as I understand it, 2D rendering technology that is kind of like a game engine. I think a lot of people like to compare it to Unity, like 2D Unity, as far as game engines go. And the benefit here, and I kind of touched on this earlier, is that if you can get a Skia renderer running on an operating system, then you can paint Flutter UI to it trivially. I mean, it's like, if it's there, if Skia exists on the system, you can write Flutter UI for it as a general rule.
A really cool concept. Historically, we as developers.
But Flutter didn't like go out and create Skia. Like, Flutter was like, oh, I mean, I can't speak for anybody, but my understanding is that Flutter was, essentially realized what they were doing. Okay. I don't want to get too much into history because it's a little murky, but as I understand it, and someone in the comments can fill in some details here, Flutter was originally a fork of Chrome, and I believe it was being used as some sort of test harness, or somebody was trying to see how far they could stretch Chrome, or like how much they could boil down the API. And they quickly realized that they had come up with like a really fast, like crazy, basically UI tool that was painting to Skia, using the Skia API. And then they quickly realized, oh, well, we can run Skia on web, we can run on desktop, we can run on mobile, we can run it in all these places. And so it kind of went from there. If anyone who knows more about this is watching this, please fill in the details below, because I'm sure that I'm not getting it all right. But hopefully I got enough wrong that somebody wants to come in and correct me and make sure that everybody gets the right information.
Have relied on the rendering or platforms that exist on the platform already, or we dive into web development and use like Chrome and its rendering. It was really cool to see Google and the Flutter team try to build a whole new rendering engine and generic layer via Skia for Android and iOS. The problem is there has been 3 decades of work put into those rendering layers on iOS and Android that they have fully left behind by inventing their own thing. And you are leaving behind so much stuff when you do that. You have given up all accessibility. You have given up all like native platform things like screen reading, scaling of fonts, resizing, all of the like awesome benefits that iOS and Android have baked in. You have just thrown away because you hate React.
Okay, so here's the thing. All the accessibility pieces that he's talking about, those have all been re-implemented in Flutter. And they're not hack jobs either, because think of it this way. A huge part of iOS's market is gaming. Gaming is huge for the iOS devices. And so many of those games are using things like Unity, they're not using native components. Unity has like its own rendering layer, and it does everything in its own rendering layer, just like Flutter does with Skia. So Apple has to make accessibility tooling available that is not using native components at all, because if they didn't, then their games would not be accessible, and they would not be able to sell these games to a huge population. So the knock on accessibility, that's not a thing. Flutter re-implements it using great tooling that iOS and Android provide, and they do so in a way that is perfectly acceptable, and it works great. So that's a non-issue.
And that's like Let
me back this up, because I think I might have missed something.
Of fonts, resizing, all of the like awesome benefits that iOS and Android have baked in, you have just thrown away because you hate React Native. And that's
a little silly. Nothing was really thrown away. It was just implemented using a different path, and it wasn't done because anybody hates React Native. Most people I know who are really top tier Flutter engineers think React Native is great for the things that it does really well.
My firm stance on Flutter, it feels as though people are betting on it because they want the benefits of React Native, but they can't get over the fact that it's React Native and that it's JavaScript. Flutter doesn't.
So there's definitely unnecessary hate for JavaScript. I think JavaScript is a fantastic language. I absolutely love writing in JavaScript, whether it's web or mobile, React Native, or on the server. JavaScript is a fantastic language. It's super high leverage. The packages that are available are incredible. The community is incredible. Because it's paradigmless, you can really go crazy and like make up some really interesting architectures that are just like not really feasible in a lot of other strict languages. So JavaScript is great. And there's a lot of people who came from strongly typed languages who have looked at JavaScript and they like just cannot wrap their head around it because it's so bizarre and unique and again, paradigmless. And it's missing a lot of tools, a lot of class-based tooling and parts that you would have in something like Java or C# or Dart or Swift, Objective-C, and so people just have Kotlin. People have a really hard time with JavaScript, and there's unnecessary hate for it. I don't think people are betting on Flutter because they hate JavaScript. There may be people who are doing that, but they're not. Great engineers who are using Flutter are not choosing it because it's not JavaScript.
Use Dart because Dart is better than JavaScript. Flutter uses Dart because Dart is not JavaScript. Flutter doesn't.
So Flutter actually uses Dart for a lot of reasons, and so you can read about them, right? Maybe the first reason is that it's controlled by Google. Google has spent a lot of time in the past trying to push JavaScript in a certain direction, and there's a lot of moving parts there, and it's an almost impossible language to control, to shape to your needs, right? So if you look at it, like Apple has Swift, and they can do whatever they need to do with it. Microsoft has TypeScript, and they can do basically whatever they want to do with it. Google's got Dart, and other languages like Golang, but as far as what we're talking about here, Google's got Dart. They have complete vertical integration within Google for building the entire tool chain, the compilers, and frameworks like Flutter, for example. And so for them, there's a huge benefit to using Dart from that point of view. There's some other technical reasons, like the ability to ahead of time compile and JIT compile so that they can do things like build really fast small binaries and ship the virtual machine and ski and all that stuff in like a tiny package. And also be able to do like basically hot module reloading. We just call it hot reloading, being able to reload Flutter apps like in real time and get UIs to change and update and keeping all the state there. So there are actual technical reasons for using Dart, but it's not because it's not JavaScript. I should be really clear about that.
Have its own rendering engine because it needs it. Flutter has its own rendering engine because it doesn't want to be like React Native. Flutter, in its very architecture and design, was built to be not React Native, and sadly, by being.
So I don't think that that's fair. First of all, I don't think the Flutter team really cares about React Native. I think that, and I can't speak for them, but I get the sense that after a few years of being in this community, I don't think anybody really cares about React Native. I think that they just decided that, they had this combination of technology. Sometimes it can be that simple. They have this combination of technology that they have control of. They have Skia, they have Dart, they have Chrome, which kind of gave birth, I believe, a little bit in like the Flutter direction. And so now they've got Flutter, and now they have complete vertical integration of the entire tool chain. They can make all the changes that they want without having to worry about dealing with these massive like JavaScript consortiums and trying to like please everybody. They can just do whatever they want. And so they have there's a huge benefit to them vertically integrating the entire tool chain, and Flutter just kind of pops out because of that. So I don't think it's because they hate anything. I think it just makes sense for them, aside from the technical reasons.
Not React Native, it has also made itself not very good. Any questions? Oh, actually, one more really cool tangent. Flutter and Skya are interesting. Skya in particular, the idea of a multi-platform rendering engine that you can target with code that isn't JavaScript and isn't native like platform code, there could potentially be some benefit to that, like games or animation or something. If we want to take advantage of that, We should. In React Native. There's already a layer called React Native Skya that's being used by, I believe, Alibaba and a few other companies in China that lets you use the Skya rendering engine in React Native. So aren't you just making your Flutter slower then? No, you're actually making it faster because Flutter is single-threaded and runs in its engine. So if you run your UI code and your API code and everything that isn't rendering outside of Flutter and just tell Flutter what to render from the outside, you can actually make your Flutter rendering app faster by writing everything else in React Native. Flutter as a technology, sure, has some.
So I'm getting a little lost here. I don't know if he's saying that React Native Skya is actually Flutter. That's not my understanding. My understanding is that React Native Skya is essentially like a supercharged canvas painter, and people are using that to build out UI, which is awesome. You know, if people want to do that, I think that's fantastic. But I'm getting a little lost. He does make an interesting point though, which I have talked to other engineers about in the past, which is that you essentially build everything in native and then only use Flutter for painting views. And I don't think it works out all the time, but for some teams, you know, who have a really heavy native platform skill set, it can be really interesting because all of a sudden all of your views are identical cross-platform, but the underlying code can be extremely performant native. But you generally don't see people do this because most Flutter developers, quite frankly, just don't want to touch native platforms, and they try to do as much as possible within Dart, and that's fine. But it's just an interesting thing that, you know, I've had conversations with in the past, and I know of some teams who have done it and have had great success with it, but it's just kind of an aside.
Interesting pieces. Flutter as a thing to build your app on, absolutely moronic. Flutter as a thing that might make React Native better in the future, cool. But yeah, betting on Flutter is betting against React Native for the sake of it. And there are so many petty, peculiar, weird, and otherwise questionable design decisions that went into how Flutter was architected. Up to I think this all is like perfectly described in my experience trying Flutter for the first and second times. When Flutter 2 dropped, I was excited to give it another go. So I installed it on my M1 MacBook. It required that you install this giant 3 gig DMG, put all of these like files in the exact right places, kind of similar to Golang where you have to build like your own file structure in order to have access to any of this stuff. Once I got it all working and I launched the dev environment, it opened up its own instance of Chrome that came bundled in the installer. And I looked at it and I was like, okay, this is bullshit. I have Chrome extensions I use every day. I would like to use my instance of Chrome. So I copied the URL, I pasted it in my browser of choice, which wasn't their Chrome, it was my Chrome. And I get a kernel panic. My computer soft locks and then shuts itself off.
Couple things. First of all, you can brew install Flutter. Works awesome. I don't know about on, you know, Windows or Linux. If anyone knows if there's quick ways to install on both those platforms, let me know. Put it in the comments. As far as the packaging Chrome, I believe the reason they do that is there's a version of Chrome called, I think, Dartium, and Dartium has some extra tooling for interacting with, I believe, the Dart VM, and also handling things like source maps, and it's got like its own tool set for dealing with Dart. So I don't know that that's what they're including, but I believe, you know, if you're seeing another like pre-bundled version of Chrome, that's probably what it is. So that's not like totally surprising. I understand wanting to use like your already existing Chrome, but I don't think that you should just write off an entire technology just because, you know, they have, again, vertically integrated like a custom browser for doing Flutter Web. The other thing too, I would say, is that if you're talking about React Native in the context of mobile, which I believe he said he was at the beginning of this video, I would suggest, you know, comparing mobile to mobile. I'm personally not the hugest fan of Flutter Web. I understand that it works for some teams. but my whole thing has always been, if you want cross-platform mobile, I like using Flutter. React Native is fine too. If you want to do web, I wouldn't even touch React. I would touch Vue. I've just had way better success with Vue in the past. It's not like I can't write React. I'm happy to write React. Have done it, decent amount. But if I were gonna start a business tomorrow and it had to be cross-platform and there wasn't anything like really crazy going on, I'd probably be Vue for web, Flutter for mobile, and maybe Flutter for desktop. But the thing is once you've got Flutter for desktop, then you can just package it typically as a web app, and it's usually just fine. So what are you going to do?
Wish I was joking. I genuinely do. But that's the state of things in Flutterland. And then I go on Twitter.
Oh, and as for the kernel panic, I don't know what to tell you. I haven't seen a kernel panic on my machine in 10 years, I think.
And people tell me how excited they are for Flutter for web to put React out forever. I can't even open the dev environment in my...
Yeah, so the people online who are like Flutter maximalists and everything else is garbage, just don't even pay attention to those people. They really have no idea what they're talking about. Flutter's a technology, and in technology, you can choose, there's so many options, and each one has a use case. And so if somebody comes out and says that Flutter is perfect for every use case, they are not an engineer, they are just a hype beast. I don't know. Fanboy, fangirl, whatever you want to call it.
Fucking browser. Get over yourselves, Flutter people. Oh, and if any of you are here, any of you like Flutter fanboys, hit me up. Let's chat. Convince me. I am genuinely down to be convinced. The problem is, every time I talk to a Flutter person, they're just a React Native hater that picked flavor of the week. There's no real Flutter fanboys. I refuse to believe it. That's my take.
Yeah, so what I would say to this person is, what I would say to Theo, you don't have to use Flutter. Maybe it hasn't made sense for any of your projects, and that's fine. I think that any stand-up Flutter engineer will fully admit that there's times to use both. And I've used React Native in the past, and I've enjoyed it. I write Flutter full-time now, and I enjoy that. There are things that I like more about one than the other. I think TypeScript is a great language. I think that when you're dealing, and this is going to sound kind of trite, but when you're dealing with any normal API that returns JSON objects, being able to basically describe the shape of those responses with TypeScript interfaces, and then just use them like without even thinking about it and having it just work perfectly every time, I think that experience is way better than any of the code-generated data classes that we have to deal with in Dart. I think that's a way better experience, and I miss that a lot. But there's other things about Dart that are really great, like the tool chain is totally opinionated and totally awesome. So you don't have to spend time like deciding which test runner you want to use. You don't have to spend time with a lot of that kind of stuff. And honestly, the IDE and configuration and getting a development environment set up, I haven't had the same experience that you mentioned. On a Mac, you can type brew install Flutter and you get Flutter and Dart on the command line in a matter of minutes. And then you got to set up, Android Studio, but that's pretty much it. So I don't know that I would, look at it as, you have to convince me to use it, because I quite frankly don't care if you use it or not. I would suggest take another look at it, and if you don't like it, you don't like it. But to me, you sound like a React Native maximalist, and you sound a lot like Flutter maximalists that I run into on Twitter all the time. So, I don't know that you've taken a high road here, but maybe I missed something.
Flutter is or Flutter for web is a second-class citizen. It's not
second-class citizen.
It's not even second-class citizen. It's a no-class citizen, because it's basically like, I look at it as Silverlight and Flash. You know, it's kind of a similar thing. So it's paving its own way, and it's, you know, I'm not convinced that it's going to be the future of web, but what it does really well is if you've written a desktop app in Flutter, for example, you can trivially package it as a web app, and you can deliver that web app, and, you know, it might take a little while to load the first time, but it's going to perform really well, and it's going to work just like a desktop app, and it's going to be, you know, on desktop, it's going to be much lighter weight than packaging a web app as Electron. So, you know, you might not see, I mean, it's all about where it was intended to run, right? So a web app, like JavaScript web app on web is going to be great. But on desktop, you got to package Chrome, you got to wrap it in something like Electron. Flutter is kind of like halfway, right? Like it's not 100% on web. It's not 100% on desktop, but in a lot of ways it's better on desktop than Electron app. So, you know, you pick and choose where you want these things. And again, it's like engineering, everything's got trade-offs.
Implies citizenship. There's no citizenship for React or for Flutter for web. They're not even trying. They made it exist so that the people who hate React can have another point in their discussion. It doesn't matter that it doesn't work. They don't care if it works. They're not shipping real software. They're just complaining.
So I think I would just, you know, anyone watching this who is, you know, starting out their career as an engineer or whatever, I would just suggest that you, how do I want to say this? People don't care about your stack as much as you think that they do, right? A stack is just a set of tools. You know, if you're a woodworker, some days you might be using a circular saw, some days you might be using a sawzall, right? You know, a sawzall is not going to do fine finish work, and a circular saw or like a cabinet table saw is not going to do like demolition work. They're two different things, and so you just pick which one you want. You pick which tool you need for the job, and then you use it. And, you know, people who use circular saws are not attacking people who use sawzalls. So I don't know. I would just suggest to not, you know, I would just say that most people don't care about your stack as much as you think that they do.
No. Even like we have like a Flutter for web app, unfortunately, at the startup that I intern at, and it's like the dev environment is slow. Pushing it to production, it's slow. Like it.
So Flutter web can be slow to develop, especially because hot reloading doesn't really exist on Flutter web. They just kind of refresh the page, and it's not good. Hot module reloading on React or Vue is way better on web than Flutter web, which is kind of interesting because Flutter's always like, we've got hot reloading, but on web it's worse than just a regular JavaScript framework. You know, even if you create like a parcel app with a single entry point for index.js, for index.html, and start loading JavaScript into it, like that experience is even better than it is on Flutter. As far as time to deploy, I haven't found that to be true. I think that web builds are faster, you know, when things are small, but as things get bigger, they kind of start to even out.
Like web is super snappy nowadays. Like there's no reason for any web app you have to be slow unless it's like really massive. And our app is like not even that big, and it still is like slow to load like that.
It's slow to load because of bundle size. Bundle size on Flutter web is really high. And I don't think that's going to come down much anytime soon. It's just part of the beast because they're shipping Skia and all this and the VM and stuff like that with it. I think they're shipping the VM. I mean, no, they're not shipping the VM because they're compiling to JavaScript. So they're shipping Skia with it for sure.
Brutal. And just the entire way that you write all the web stuff is not fun. So
yeah,
it's brutal.
Yeah. So I'm seeing a lot of people in chat now saying they agree Flutter for web is bad, but they disagree with mobile. But okay, I guess I'll reframe this. Why would any developer pick Flutter over React Native right now? What benefit do they get by picking React Native or by picking Flutter? Speed? Okay. So we have speed so far. Performance in Flutter theoretically can be faster for like certain animation tasks if you don't properly offload them. But generally speaking,
So the problem with questions like this is if you ask somebody, an open-ended question like that, there's no application to, fit the question. So there's really no answer. So, it feels like the argument feels like a win, but it's really, you don't really get anywhere with it. So you need to like really, say what for. Like, okay, we want to build this app. Why would you use Flutter? We want to build this kind of app. Why would you use React Native? When you don't have an application, then it's all just conjecture. It's kind of a pointless argument.
React Native can be and often is just as fast as Flutter.
Also, wouldn't you get...
So most of these frameworks are so fast that the speed thing is kind of irrelevant. Because if you're, hitting an endpoint, loading data and displaying it on your device, and you're scrolling, and you have like lazy loaded, like scrolling elements and stuff like that, they're all pretty much the same and they're all pretty much fast enough. So I don't think that there's really a huge performance difference between the two, like in a basic sense.
Like all the performance benefits from Flutter if you use, or I'm sorry, from React Native if you use Skya.
Yep.
Anyways,
yeah, you can get all of the Flutter benefits.
Have I been saying Skia wrong this whole time? Because I've always said Skia, so I don't know if it's Skia or Skya at this point, but I'm going to keep calling it Skia unless someone tells me differently.
React Native with React Native Skya, especially as that matures. So if you're building a new app right now, by the time your app's big enough to be slow, React Native Skya will be real enough that if Flutter could theoretically have saved you, it will now save you.
Oh, yeah.
So here's the problem. Flutter is Dart VM and Skia, but it's also the entire UI library that facilitates that. So to just say that React Native Skia is going to overtake Flutter is kind of silly because it doesn't have that entire UI framework bundled with it, which is really what makes Flutter really quite good. It brings us to another point. He had said something like, why would a developer use Flutter instead of React Native? Well, Flutter has a really great UI library that, you might not use it all the time for like a really big app, but it's really good for very fast functional prototyping. And there's a ton of value in being able to communicate concept to a developer and have them be able to functionally prototype it very quickly. So that, there's other times where you'd want to use Flutter, but that's a good example. And I know there's UI libraries for React Native, but it doesn't have that vertically integrated feeling where everything is just kind of built to work together really well and really quickly and just remove all the questions that you have to ask. You don't go searching for which UI library you want to use. You just use the one that comes with Flutter and it works great.
It's being maintained, I think, by Shopify now, right? Or at least the Docs website is hosted by Shopify. So
the English one for sure, but I'm pretty sure, honestly, like China has been taking over the React Native Skya stuff.
Okay, so anyway, this was a reaction video. No shade towards Theo. I have no doubt that he is a competent engineer and prefers React Native, and that's fine. Everyone has their own preferences, and everyone gets paid to do different things. I would just suggest that anyone reading this or anyone watching this, just try to take a step back and look at these things as tools, not as lifestyles. So Flutter isn't a lifestyle. Flutter isn't a personality. Flutter is a tool. It's a framework. There's some things it does well, and there's some things it does poorly. And as an engineer, it's your job to figure out what those things are and to make sure that it's not going to be detrimental to the project that you're doing for your client or for your employer. Or even for yourself. So just keep that in mind and take slow, deliberate steps and make the right decision. And then when you got it figured out, execute like crazy. Thank you very much.